The frozen road behind Russ Porter's truck should have been empty. But through the falling snow, an old German shepherd kept running on painfully injured paws. His body was weak from hunger, his muzzle swollen, crooked from dozens of bee stings. Yet he refused to stop. When Russ offered food, the dog barely touched it, then turned toward the western forest and begged him to follow. What waited beyond those trees was not an abandoned home, but a woman whose voice had been erased one forged document at a time. And somehow the injured K-9 was trusting a broken Navy SEAL to bring her back. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe as we work toward 5,000 subscribers and more stories worth remembering. By late February, Ash Hollow had forgotten what bare ground looked like. Snow lay over the Wyoming Valley in old, hardened layers, gray where the wind had polished it and blue where shadows gathered beneath the pines. The dirt roads had frozen into crooked bands of ice. Fence posts rose from the white fields like the ribs of buried animals, while the scattered ranch houses of elderly farmers stood miles apart, each chimney sending up a thin signal that someone inside was still holding winter at bay. Russ Porter knew most of those houses by their failures. He knew which generator coughed when the temperature dropped below zero, which barn door would jump its track in a west wind, and which widow kept putting off replacing a cracked stovepipe because she insisted the old one had at least one more winter in it. Russ was 51, 6 feet tall, and broad through the shoulders, though his strength no longer had the polished look of a man training for war. It had become the practical strength of splitting wood, dragging engines across frozen floors, and lifting things that should have required 2 men, because asking for help meant waiting. His face was long and weathered, with high, hollowed cheekbones and a nose that had once been broken badly enough to lean slightly left. Brown-gray hair fell over his forehead and curled at the back of his neck. A short boxed beard hid part of a pale scar descending from his left ear toward his jaw. People in Ash Hollow called Russ dependable. They rarely called him friendly. That afternoon, he had spent 3 hours repairing the furnace in the small ranch house of Caleb Ross, an 80-year-old horse breeder who treated every machine as though it had betrayed him personally. "I could make coffee," Caleb had said when the burner finally caught. Russ had already been closing his toolbox. "Got some at home." Caleb looked toward the empty cup sitting on the workbench. "Sure you do?" Russ pretended not to hear. He was good at leaving before gratitude became conversation. Gratitude had a way of opening doors. First came coffee, then questions, then someone asking how he had been sleeping or whether he had heard from Caroline. It was easier to leave while everyone still thought he was merely busy. Outside, the air felt wrong for February. A Chinook had rolled down from the mountains before noon, lifting the temperature sharply enough to loosen icicles from the eaves. Water ran in narrow channels beneath the roadside snow. The wind carried the damp smell of exposed earth, old manure, pine bark, and something faintly sweet that Russ could not identify. The warmth would not last. A wall of dark cloud already stood over the western ridge, promising that winter would return by nightfall and freeze everything the thaw had softened. Russ drove north in his battered charcoal pickup, one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the heater vent. He wore an olive-drab combat shirt beneath an open brown canvas coat. The camouflage sleeves were faded at the elbows, 2 dark horizontal bands circling each upper arm. The shirt was older than most things he owned, but it fit closely and never caught on tools. The road was empty. That was why the movement behind him registered at once. Russ glanced into the rearview mirror. At first, he thought a dark strip of brush had blown loose and was tumbling along the shoulder. Then the shape stumbled, recovered, and kept running. A dog. Russ eased off the accelerator. The animal was perhaps 50 yards behind the truck, struggling down the center of the frozen road. It was large, long-backed, and moving with the uneven determination of something that had gone past exhaustion and no longer understood it was allowed to stop. Russ drove another 100 yards. The dog kept following. He told himself it was chasing the smell of food from Caleb's ranch. A stray would follow any vehicle if it believed something edible might fall out. Ash Hollow had its share of abandoned animals, especially after bad winters and worse decisions. Russ pressed the accelerator lightly. In the mirror, the dog's front legs buckled. It hit the ice chest first, slid, then forced itself upright. Russ swore under his breath and braked. The truck stopped with a crunch of dirty snow. He sat behind the wheel for several seconds, watching the mirror. The dog had stopped too. It stood in the road with its head hanging low. Its sides moved quickly. One front paw lifted and lowered again, as if the ice beneath it burned. Russ looked toward the western ridge. The temperature was already falling. "This isn't my road," he muttered. The dog did not hear him. That was the problem with saying things aloud when a person lived alone. Eventually, every statement began sounding like an argument no one else had agreed to join. Russ opened the door. The wind caught his coat immediately. He stepped down, leaving the engine running, and took a small paper sack from behind the seat. Inside was half a roast beef sandwich Caleb's neighbor had handed him that morning. Russ walked 20 feet from the truck and crouched. He did not face the dog directly. He turned one shoulder away, placed a piece of meat on the ice, then back toward the front tire. The German shepherd did not rush forward. That caught Russ's attention. A starving stray usually abandoned caution once food appeared. This dog remained where it was, trembling so hard the fur along its ribs seemed to shiver independently. Beneath mud and wet snow, the coat was yellow-black, though the yellow carried a dark honey tone. A broad black saddle lay unevenly across its back, heavier on the left side. The dog's ribs were visible. Its paws were worse. Cracks split the pads, and a thin trail of blood marked the road behind it. Still, the animal held itself with a strange formality. Its head was low, but its shoulders remained square. Even near collapse, it appeared to be waiting for permission. Russ's attention sharpened. He had seen that kind of restraint before. Years earlier, overseas, Navy teams had occasionally moved alongside military dog handlers. Russ had never been a handler, but he had learned enough to avoid making an injured working dog feel cornered. He lowered one hand, palm relaxed. "Easy." The shepherd's ears shifted. The left stood straighter than the right. The right ear had a small piece missing near the tip. Russ tried a basic command. "Come." The response was immediate, though weak. The dog took one step, then another. The movement was not the hopeful scramble of a pet hearing a familiar word. It was obedience, old, ingrained, and almost stronger than the body carrying it. Russ felt something tighten behind his ribs. The shepherd reached the meat, but did not eat it. Instead, it raised its head. Russ saw the muzzle clearly for the first time. The dog's snout was badly swollen, especially along the right side. The lower lip sagged. The flesh around the mouth and eyes was red and stretched, dotted with small raised welts. Its breath came through the nose in rough, wet pulls. Jesus! Russ moved closer before remembering caution and stopped himself. The dog swayed. Up close, he could see more welts beneath the fur around the ears and throat. One eye watered continuously. Silver had begun to gather around the chin, marking the dog as old enough to have already given most of its strength to somebody else. Russ poured water into the clean lid of a storage container and set it down. The shepherd drank only a few mouthfuls. Then it stepped away, not toward the food, toward Russ. The dog circled him once, brushing its shoulder against his knee. It turned its head toward the western tree line, stared for several seconds, then looked back at him. Russ frowned. The dog repeated the motion. Around him, toward the woods, back to Russ. "You want me to follow you?" The shepherd gave a strained whine, barely more than air. Then its rear legs folded. Russ caught the animal beneath the chest before it struck the ice. The dog stiffened at the contact, but it did not snap. For one brief second, its amber eyes met his. There was fear there, pain too, but not the blank desperation of an animal seeking shelter. The dog was trying to remain conscious for a reason. Russ looked toward the forest. The road curved west beyond a line of pines and disappeared into the lowering gray. He could follow now. He could put the dog in the truck and drive toward whatever place it had come from. But the shepherd's breathing was becoming shallower. A choice formed in Russ with the familiar cold clarity that had once governed decisions made under gunfire. Preserve the life in front of him first. Everything else came after. He lifted the dog. The shepherd was lighter than it should have been. Beneath the wet coat, its body felt all bone, heat, and trembling effort. Russ placed it across the back seat on an old wool blanket, then climbed into the truck. As he turned around at the next wide patch of road, the dog tried to rise. "Stay down!" It obeyed for 3 seconds, then it pushed its head against the window and looked west. Russ watched through the mirror. "I saw." The dog's ears shifted at the sound of his voice. "I said I saw." He drove home faster than the road deserved. The cabin stood among lodgepole pines at the northern edge of Ash Hollow, a low structure of dark timber with a metal roof and a porch that leaned slightly toward the east. Russ carried the shepherd inside and laid it near the wood stove. The dog attempted to stand again. Russ blocked it gently with one forearm. "Not happening." He called Dr. Lila Brennan. Lila ran the only veterinary practice within many miles, treating everything from house cats to calving cows. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice clipped by road noise. "What did you find this time?" "I didn't find it." That sentence has never improved anything. Russ described the swelling and labored breathing. Lila's tone changed at once. "Keep him warm. Don't give him food. Small amounts of water only. I'm coming." "He could be female." "Is he?" Russ glanced beneath the dog. "No." "Then congratulations on your diagnostic breakthrough." She hung up. 25 minutes later, headlights swept across the cabin windows. Lila Brennan came through the door carrying a dark medical bag, followed by Nora Finch, her 26-year-old assistant. Lila was a sturdy woman with wind-reddened cheeks, hazel eyes, and brown-red hair twisted into a low, untidy knot. Snow clung to her brick-red barn coat. Nora was slimmer, with short, dark blonde hair swept to one side and a mustard-colored puffer jacket zipped to her chin. She carried fluids, blankets, and a compact camera used for medical documentation. Lila knelt beside the shepherd. "Well," she said softly, "you've had a terrible opinion of the week." The dog watched her hands. When Lila reached for the neck, its body tightened. Russ moved into view, lowering one hand near the floor. "Easy." The shepherd's gaze shifted to him. The muscles loosened. Lila noticed, but said nothing. She administered medication for the allergic reaction, started fluids, and checked the airway. Nora cleaned the torn paw pads while photographing the wounds and recording their condition. "Multiple stings," Lila said. "Face, ears, throat, maybe more under the coat." "Bees in February?" "With today's Chinook, they could have broken cluster if the hives were disturbed. Knock over enough boxes during a warm spell, and you'd have angry bees with nowhere sensible to go." Russ remembered the faint sweetness in the wind. Honey. Lila ran her hands carefully across the dog's chest. Beneath the filthy coat, her fingers paused over thickened patches of skin. "Harness calluses." She checked the teeth, shoulders, and a long scar running down the right side. This dog worked. Russ looked at the shepherd. "Police?" Could be military, but he was trained well, and not recently. Nora cut away the frayed remains of the leather collar. A scratched metal tag hung beneath it. Russ took the tag and wiped it with his thumb. Most of the lettering had been worn smooth. One word remained: Mason. The dog's left ear lifted at the sound when Russ read it aloud. Mason. The amber eyes opened fully. For the first time since the road, the shepherd's expression changed. Not much, only enough to show that the name still belonged to him. Night settled around the cabin. Lila and Nora left after the breathing stabilized, promising to return at first light. Russ sat in the wooden chair beside the stove while Mason lay wrapped in blankets near his boots. For almost an hour, the dog slept. Then Mason woke, dragged himself upright, and limped toward the door. Russ caught the support harness Lila had left behind and guided him back. No. Mason stared at the door, then toward Russ, then west, though no window faced that direction. Russ settled him onto the blanket again. Minutes later, Mason tried once more. This time, Russ sat on the floor beside him. "You'll die out there," Mason's breathing rasped. "You understand that?" The dog lowered its body, but did not close its eyes. Russ looked toward the silent room, the single plate drying by the sink, the unused chair across from his, the wall where a framed photograph had once hung before he had finally turned it face down and put it in a drawer. 4 years earlier, Caroline had stood in that room with a suitcase by the door. She had not screamed. That had been worse. "I don't know how to reach you anymore," she had said. Russ had watched her leave because following would have required words he did not know how to give. Now Mason pushed himself forward across the floor, not toward the door this time, toward Russ. The old dog rested his swollen, crooked muzzle on Russ's knee. The weight was slight. The meaning was not. Russ held still. After a long moment, he placed one rough hand against the side of Mason's neck. The dog exhaled and closed his eyes, but only after Russ had accepted the touch. Russ looked toward the dark window. Somewhere west of the cabin, something had happened badly enough to drive an old K-9 through ice, hunger, and pain in search of help. Mason had not chosen Russ because he needed a home. He had chosen him because he needed someone who would understand that resting was not the same as giving up. And in the quiet cabin, beside the fading fire, Russ realized the wounded dog had placed something in his hands that he had spent years refusing to carry. Responsibility for another living heart. Morning came without sunlight. The Chinook had vanished during the night, and winter had returned to Ash Hollow with the vindictive patience of something that had only stepped outside for a moment. The puddles beneath the cabin eaves had frozen into glass. Snow hissed against the windows, fine and dry, while the stove settled with small iron clicks. Mason was standing at the door. Russ found him there before dawn, front legs braced too wide, bandaged paws planted on the plank floor. The old shepherd's body trembled from the effort, but his eyes remained fixed on the narrow seam beneath the door as if the western wind were carrying a message through it. "You're supposed to be resting." Mason did not move. Russ filled a bowl with water and set it nearby. Mason drank, but only after Russ nudged the bowl within reach. Then the dog resumed his vigil. At 7, Dr. Lila Brennan arrived to check the swelling. Her brick-red coat was dusted with snow, and her brown-red hair had escaped its low knot in several stubborn strands. She examined Mason's airway, the wounds around his ears, and the pads Nora had wrapped the night before. "He's improved," she said, "which is not the same thing as healthy." Mason looked toward the door. Lila followed his gaze. No, the right ear tilted outward. That expression might work on people with weaker character. Russ leaned against the kitchen counter. "You brought him back from half dead. Now he thinks you work for him." "I work for everyone. Nobody pays on time." She replaced the bandage on Mason's front paw and pressed 2 fingers gently along his ribs. The dog tolerated the examination, but when she tried to guide him toward the blanket, he planted his weight and resisted. Not violently, not even stubbornly in the ordinary way. He simply refused to lie down. Lila sat back on her heels. What exactly did he do on the road? Russ explained the circling, the repeated looks toward the western forest, and the way Mason had tried to rise in the truck. "You think someone is out there," she said. "I think he does." "That isn't proof." "No. And if you take him into the snow, he could collapse." "I'm not making him walk." Lila studied Russ's face. She had known him long enough to recognize the difference between a decision and the final few seconds before one. "You have a support harness?" Russ nodded toward the chair. "You keep him in the truck. You stop if his breathing worsens. You call me the moment you find anything." "I will." "That was too fast. I don't trust it." "It's still the answer." Lila sighed and tightened Mason's bandage. "The two of you deserve each other." Russ chose not to ask whether she meant that kindly. He carried Mason to the truck despite the dog's obvious dislike of being lifted. The shepherd had enough pride left to make his body rigid, as though refusing to acknowledge that his legs could not manage the porch steps. Russ spread blankets across the back seat and opened the window by an inch. "We do this my way." Mason looked at him. "That means you sit there and point." The dog sneezed weakly. Russ took it as consent. They drove west. The road climbed out of Ash Hollow through low hills where the wind had stripped snow from the sagebrush. Mason rested for the first mile, head against the seat, but at the first fork he forced himself upright. His nose angled left. Russ turned. At the next junction, Mason chose right. The route was not direct. It wound between neglected fences, past a collapsed sheep shed, then followed a narrow county track that appeared to lead nowhere but the foothills. Each time Russ wondered whether the dog was confused, Mason would settle briefly, conserving strength until another turn approached. He was not tracking a scent through the closed truck. He remembered the road. That realization changed the weight of the journey. Mason was not leading Russ toward a random place where something bad might have happened. He was taking him home. The first sign of the farm was a wooden board leaning beneath a drift. Only part of the lettering remained visible. Whitaker Honey Russ stopped and brushed snow from the lower half with his glove. Beneath the name, smaller words had been painted by hand. Honest work, honest price. The paint had faded, but the lettering was steady and careful. Beyond the sign stood a farmhouse, a weathered barn, and rows of pale blue beehive boxes scattered across a gentle slope. Or what remained of them. Many had been overturned. Wooden frames lay broken in the snow. Dark clusters of dead bees clung to exposed comb. Honey had spilled before the cold returned, and now shone in frozen amber sheets beneath a thin skin of ice. Russ shut off the engine. Mason rose immediately. "Wait." The dog's claws scraped the blanket. Russ walked the site first. The sweetness he had smelled in the wind the previous afternoon was stronger here, mixed with wet wood and the faint sourness of damaged wax. He crouched near one overturned hive. The snow beneath it had melted during the Chinook, then refrozen around the broken box. This was recent. Not a month old, not even a week. He moved carefully along the slope. Tire tracks entered from the east gate and crossed the newest snowfall. The tread was deep, likely from a heavy truck. Near the barn were 3 distinct sets of boot prints, their edges still sharp where the wind had not reached them. Russ counted without meaning to. 1 large pair, 1 narrow, 1 with a worn heel on the right boot. His old instincts had not disappeared. They had merely changed uniforms. At the rear fence he found blood on a splintered rail. Dark, dry, but not weathered. A few strands of black and gold fur were caught beside it. Mason's. Russ followed the marks to a low wooden outbuilding behind the barn. The padlock lay in the snow, its shackle cut cleanly through. Inside, the air smelled of urine, old straw, and confinement. A metal water bowl sat in one corner, coated with a mineral ring. Beside it was a dented food pan containing a few hardened scraps. A short chain had been fastened around a support post. The leather end was chewed nearly through. Long scratch marks scarred the inside of the door. Russ stood very still. For a month, someone had kept Mason here, not cared for him, not truly, kept him alive. He imagined the old dog hearing vehicles come and go, hearing doors slam, waiting for the one voice that never returned. The image carried no battlefield grandeur. There was nothing heroic about a dog scratching at wood in the dark. That made it worse. A low sound came from outside. Mason stood beside the truck, pressing against the open door despite the support harness. He had seen the shed. Russ returned and helped him down. The dog moved slowly across the snow. When he reached the doorway, his whole body tightened. He did not enter. He only stared inside, ears angled forward, breath shallow. Russ rested one hand on the harness. Mason leaned back against his leg. It was the first time the dog had sought support without being too weak to avoid it. Russ said nothing. Together they turned away from the shed. The farmhouse door stood partly open. The frame around the lock had been splintered, but the damage had been pushed nearly closed from the outside, as though someone wanted it overlooked from the road. Russ called the county sheriff's office. Deputy Evan Cross arrived 30 minutes later in a brown and black patrol SUV. He stepped out already pulling on gloves, his movements careful and efficient. At 33, Evan had the lean build of a man who spent more time climbing fences and sitting behind a wheel than lifting weights. His tan uniform was neat beneath a dark winter jacket, and a small scar divided his right eyebrow. His gaze went first to Russ, then to Mason, then to the broken hives. "You touched anything?" The sign. Shed door was already open. Evan checked the camera mounted on his chest. Once, then a second time. Russ noticed. Evan followed his gaze. "I like records that don't change their minds. Useful habit, especially around you." There was no hostility in the remark, only professional caution. Russ accepted it. They entered the house together. The kitchen looked interrupted rather than abandoned. A loaf of bread sat beneath a cloth on the counter. One end had been cut away, and the exposed surface was dry but not molded. A carton of eggs remained in the refrigerator beside jars of preserved peaches and several bottles of medication. One prescription had been opened recently. According to the label, Irene Whitaker was meant to take 1 tablet every morning. More than half remained, though the refill date was less than 6 weeks old. The telephone had been pulled from the wall. In the front room, drawers stood open. Papers had been scattered across the floor. Yet a silver tea service remained untouched in a glass cabinet, and Russ found cash inside an envelope near the sewing basket. "Not robbery," he said. Evan knelt near the broken lock. "Looks more like someone searching." "For what?" "That's one of the questions I'm hoping the house answers without our help." Mason moved through the rooms with increasing urgency. His steps were weak, but each familiar scent seemed to lend him a little more strength. He stopped at the base of the stairs, then at a coat hook where a faded blue jacket still hung. Finally, he entered the front parlor. A wooden rocking chair sat beside the cold fireplace. Draped over one arm was a lavender wool scarf. Mason reached it and pressed his muzzle into the fabric. The swollen right side made the movement awkward. He inhaled once, then again. His legs folded beneath him. Russ stepped forward, afraid he had collapsed, but Mason was not unconscious. He settled his head across his paws and remained beside the chair. The urgency had left him, not because he had found the person he wanted, because he had reached the last place where her presence still felt whole. Evan stood in the doorway. "That's Irene's chair," he said. "You know her?" Everybody knows Irene Whitaker. He removed one glove and rubbed his thumb along the small, coin-shaped bulge inside his shirt pocket before pulling out his phone. I need to check the file. He made 2 calls. The first was short and official. The second lasted longer, with Evan asking for dates, signatures, and the name of a facility. When he finished, he looked older than when he had arrived. According to county records, Irene moved to Silver Pines Care Center near Casper 31 days ago. Voluntarily? That's what the documents say. Cognitive decline, medical recommendation, signed power of attorney transferring temporary management of the property. Russ looked around the ransacked room. And Mason? Evan glanced at the dog beside the scarf. The file says nothing about him. Would she leave without him? Evan did not answer immediately. On the wall behind the rocking chair hung a photograph of an older man in a sheriff's uniform, kneeling beside a younger Mason. Irene stood on the other side, one hand on the dog's back. Her hair had been gray then, rather than white, but the eyes were unmistakable, pale, steady, and amused by something outside the frame. Amos Whitaker was sheriff before Pike, Evan said. Mason was one of the department's K-9s. When the dog retired, Amos and Irene took him home. After Amos died, Irene barely went anywhere without Mason. Russ pointed toward the scarf. She didn't leave voluntarily. Evan's jaw tightened. The documents say she did. The dog says she didn't. I can't put that in a report. No, but you can put in the broken lock, the severed chain, the fresh tire tracks, and the fact that somebody kept an old K-9 imprisoned for almost a month. Evan looked toward the shed through the window. That I can use. Near the back door, Russ found a strip of purple wool caught on a protruding nail. It matched the scarf in the parlor, but the fibers were newer at the tear, bright beneath the dust. Evan photographed it. Outside, they followed the tire tracks as far as the main gate. Snow had filled the road beyond, but the impressions around the hives remained clear enough to show that the vehicles had arrived recently. 2 days, perhaps less. The people who had taken Irene had returned. They had broken the hives, searched the house, and opened the shed, or Mason had escaped while they were there. In the chaos, the old dog had run into the disturbed bees, then chased their vehicle until his body failed. Russ understood the sequence. What he did not understand was why anyone would come back after 31 days. To find something, or to remove it. By late afternoon, the temperature had fallen hard. Evan sealed the house and requested a formal scene examination. He warned Russ not to return without authorization. Russ nodded, which did not appear to reassure him. They carried Mason back to the truck. The dog resisted only when the rocking chair disappeared from view. Then he released a soft sound and turned his head toward the farmhouse window. Russ placed the lavender scarf beneath Mason's chin. The dog became still. On the drive back, Mason did not watch the intersections. He no longer needed to guide Russ. He had shown him the house, the shed, the shattered hives, and the empty chair. The road had ended. The absence had not. That evening, Russ sat beside Mason in the cabin while snow began covering the truck tracks outside. The old dog slept with his nose pressed to Irene's scarf. For the first time since Russ had found him, Mason did not face the door. He had brought someone home. Now it was Russ's turn to understand why home had been emptied. Mason began eating again on the 3rd morning. Not much. A few softened pieces of kibble mixed with broth, taken slowly because the swelling along the right side of his muzzle still made chewing awkward. When he finished, 3 pieces remained at the edge of the bowl. Russ added more broth. Mason looked at him, then at the untouched food. "You missed some." The old shepherd lowered himself beside the stove and left the bowl exactly as it was. The same thing happened at noon, and again that evening. By the 2nd day, Russ understood. Mason was not losing interest in the food. He was saving it. For Irene. The knowledge settled over the cabin without announcement. Russ stopped pushing the bowl closer. Each night he covered the remaining food and set it aside, though he knew no one would come through the door to claim it. Mason's recovery moved in small, stubborn increments. The welts around his eyes faded. The bandages on his paws needed changing less often. He could cross the room without collapsing, though his right hind leg dragged for the first few steps after sleep. Trust grew just as slowly. Russ cleaned the cracked pads without holding Mason down. He spoke before touching the scarred shoulder. If the dog turned away, Russ waited. At night, Mason no longer pressed himself against the door. He slept several feet from it, facing west. Once, Russ woke with his heart racing and the taste of dust in his mouth. For several seconds, the cabin was not a cabin. The black window looked like an open doorway overseas, and the hiss of the stove became radiostatic. Mason was sitting beside the chair. He did not climb onto Russ or paw at him. He remained still, amber eyes watching, as if waiting for a command the man had forgotten how to give. Russ reached down. Only then did Mason move close enough for Russ's hand to rest between his ears. The breathing in the room steadied, first the man's, then the dog's. Neither of them treated the moment as remarkable the next morning. That was perhaps why it mattered. On the fourth day, Deputy Evan Cross arrived carrying a paper folder thick enough to bend beneath its own weight. He removed his boots at the door without being asked, glanced at the 3 pieces of kibble still sitting beneath a cloth on the counter, and chose not to comment. "I'm not officially here," he said. Russ poured coffee into a second mug. "That why you parked behind the woodpile?" "That, and your driveway is trying to kill people." Russ handed him the mug. "It's selective." Evan set the folder on the table and opened it. "Irene's transfer file looks clean from a distance." "Meaning?" "Meaning someone expected people to stop looking after the first page." The medical assessment stated that Irene Whitaker had shown increasing confusion, poor judgment, and an inability to manage medication or property. It had been signed by Dr. Malcolm Hurst. Evan tapped the name. Hurst listed an in-person evaluation at Irene's house. He wasn't there. "You know that?" "The date is January 12th. I replaced her generator belt that morning. Stayed until after lunch." Evan looked up. "You saw her?" "She beat me twice at gin rummy while I waited for the part to warm." "Did she seem confused?" "She accused me of cheating and was correct." Evan wrote that down. The next document granted temporary power of attorney to a representative of Pinecrest Holdings. It had been notarized at a legal office in Laramie. "The office closed 3 months before this was signed," Evan said. "The notary license attached to it belongs to a man who moved to Idaho last year." Russ turned the page. Silver Pines Care Center appeared throughout the insurance paperwork, billing for room, medication management, memory care, and physical assistance. "They say she's there?" "They say they've never admitted anyone named Irene Whitaker." "Then who billed the insurance?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." The final page transferred management, not ownership, at least not yet, of Irene's land to Pinecrest Holdings on grounds that the property needed maintenance while she received long-term care. Evan leaned back. "Pinecrest was formed 9 months ago. No employees, no physical office. Registered agent is a law firm in Cheyenne." "Who owns it?" 2 holding companies and a trust." "That answer's supposed to make me feel better?" "No. It's supposed to make me understand why financial crimes investigators drink." Mason rose and approached the table. He sniffed the folder, then placed his head against Russ's thigh. Evan watched him. "The sheriff thinks Irene's family handled it." "What family?" "A niece in Colorado, maybe a cousin in Nebraska." "Anyone speak to them?" The file says notifications were sent. Sent isn't answered. Evan closed the folder. Sheriff Pike told me to stop treating paperwork errors like a kidnapping. Russ's thumb moved across the worn edge of his field watch. And what do you think? I think errors usually disagree with each other. These all point in the same direction. That afternoon, Lila arrived without her veterinary bag. "We're going to May's," she announced. Russ remained seated. "No? It wasn't a question." "Mason needs rest. Nora is coming to sit with him." "I don't need someone sitting with my—" Russ stopped. Lila's eyebrows rose. Mason looked between them. "Your what?" she asked. Russ stood and reached for his coat. "Truck's warming?" May Holloway's diner sat at the center of Ash Hollow between a hardware store and a post office that opened whenever the postmaster's truck could get through. The sign outside read Holloway's, though everyone called it May's because there had never been another Holloway willing to wake before 4 a.m. and make 6 kinds of pie. May herself was 66, compact and upright, with silver hair pinned into a bun so tight it seemed capable of influencing local weather. She wore a pale blue blouse beneath a white apron and moved through the diner carrying 3 coffee pots as if all of them had personally disappointed her. When Russ entered with Lila and Evan, the room quieted for half a second. Then spoons resumed striking cups. May pointed toward the rear booth. "You 3 look like either a committee or bad news." "Coffee," Lila said. "So, bad news." May filled the cups and sat opposite Russ without waiting to be invited. The diner's morning crowd had thinned, leaving only 2 ranchers near the window and an elderly couple sharing toast at the counter. A chalkboard by the kitchen listed names of people who could not afford meals that week. Beside several names, someone had drawn a small B. Russ noticed. "Irene," May said. "She covered those." "Every week?" Evan asked. "Every Friday. Honey money went into the winter kitchen fund. She kept track better than the county." "When did you last see her?" May did not answer immediately. She looked toward the chalkboard. "January 18th. She sat right there." She pointed to the booth behind Russ. "She complained my biscuits had become philosophical." Russ frowned. "She said they offered resistance without purpose." Lila almost smiled. "Did she seem confused?" Evan asked. "She remembered which pie I burned in 2009. "Which one?" "Peach. And it was one pie, not a pattern." May folded her hands. Irene was tired, worried, but not confused. She asked whether anyone had heard from Henry Bell after he moved. Then she asked if Summit Vale had bought the Miller parcel. The name shifted the air around the table. Russ had heard of Summit Vale Development. Everyone in the valley had. For 2 years, its representatives had spoken at town meetings about jobs, tourism, tax revenue, and the future. The proposed ski resort would sit beyond the western ridge, with a new access road cutting through several old properties. May got up and returned with her phone. "A month ago, I received this." The email was short. "I have chosen to enter residential care for my health. Please respect my privacy. I will not be receiving visitors or calls. Thank you for understanding. Irene." Evan read it twice. "What's wrong with it?" Russ asked. May looked almost offended. "She signed it wrong." Lila leaned closer. May opened older emails. Each ended the same way. Irene W., sometimes followed by a B symbol, sometimes by a complaint about May's coffee. "She never signed only Irene," May said. "Said there were too many Irenes in the world and most of them lacked discipline." "Why didn't you question it?" Evan asked. May's expression changed. Not defensiveness. Shame. "Because a woman from Silver Pines called the next day, said Irene was safe but overwhelmed, asked us not to upset her." "Did you get a name?" "No. I wanted to believe it." The sentence was quiet enough to make the diner seem larger. May looked at Russ. People think forgetting someone happens all at once. It doesn't. You accept one explanation, then another. You tell yourself privacy is kindness. By the time the silence feels wrong, you've already helped build it. Russ thought of Caroline's suitcase, of watching someone leave because silence had seemed easier than saying the wrong thing. May scrolled through her phone. The church received the same email. So did 3 Honey customers and Irene's niece. Lila checked. Lila nodded. All sent within 6 minutes. Same wording. Evan asked for copies. May sent them, then rose and walked to the register. She returned with a folded newspaper clipping. A photograph showed Darrell Boone presenting portable heaters to a group of elderly residents outside the church. He stood in the center wearing a camel-colored cashmere coat, gray blonde hair combed neatly back, one gloved hand resting on the shoulder of a woman using a walker. The smile was generous. The eyes were not. Summit Vale funded those heaters, May said. Darrell made certain the photographer arrived first. Russ studied the man. Pinecrest? Evan had already taken out his phone. 20 minutes later, he had the answer. Pinecrest Holdings shared a registered law firm with 2 subsidiaries controlled by Summit Vale Development. The resort roadmap was public. Lila pulled it up on May's old laptop and enlarged the western section. The proposed route ran directly across Irene's land. Without the Whitaker property, the road would have to bend north through a mapped avalanche corridor, requiring bridges, retaining structures, and years of additional environmental review. Irene's farm was not merely useful. It was the hinge on which the entire project turned. 2 days later, Evan obtained limited authorization to inspect the remaining outbuildings at the Whitaker property. The warrant was based on signs of unlawful animal confinement, recent forced entry, and evidence that the owner's location had been falsely documented. Russ accompanied him as a witness familiar with the property's recent condition. Mason stayed in the truck until they reached a storage shed behind the apiary. The door was swollen shut. Inside, dust-covered shelves of jars, frames, and old tools. Bundles of correspondence sat in a wooden crate beneath a workbench. The earliest letters from Summit Vale were polite. They praised Irene's stewardship of the land and offered a price above market value. The next letter increased the offer. The next mentioned the burden of maintaining rural property at her age. Later letters suggested that selling would allow Irene to transition with dignity. The final envelope contained no offer at all, only a single page. If you continue to refuse, this winter may become very difficult for you. Evan read the sentence, then slipped the page into an evidence sleeve. No signature, Russ said. People like this prefer threats that can pretend to be weather forecasts. From outside came the scrape of claws. Mason stood at the shed entrance, breathing hard from the short walk. Russ had not called him over. The dog moved past them toward a mound of old straw in the rear corner. He pawed once, stopped to regain balance, then pawed again. Russ crouched and pulled the straw aside. A tarnished sheriff's badge lay beneath it. Amos Whitaker. Under the badge was a small digital recorder wrapped in cloth. Evan photographed it, where it lay before placing it in an evidence bag. Back at the patrol vehicle, he connected headphones and checked the files. Most were Irene's spoken notes, hive conditions, honey deliveries, names of people needing meals. The final recording began with silence. Then Irene's voice, steady though strained. My name is Irene Whitaker. I am of sound mind. I have not agreed to sell my land. I have not signed power of attorney to Pinecrest Holdings. A chair scraped in the background. If anyone says I left Ash Hollow willingly, they are lying. Russ looked toward the farmhouse. The recording continued. A vehicle door slammed outside. Men's voices approached. One of them ordered Irene to open the door. Mason began barking. The sound was younger than the dog standing beside Russ now, stronger and furious enough to distort the microphone. Wood cracked. Someone shouted. Then came the heavy collapse of stacked hive boxes and the frantic roar of disturbed bees. Irene's breath caught. A man said something too muffled to understand. Then Irene spoke one final word, clear enough that no one in the truck could mistake it. "Daryl." The recording ended. Mason stood beside the open door, staring at the device in Evan's hand. Russ could not know whether the dog recognized Irene's voice through the tiny speaker. But Mason's body became perfectly still, not hopeful, not relieved, ready. The letters had lied. The empty house had lied. The official file had lied. But Irene Whitaker had left her own voice behind. And for the first time, the silence surrounding her disappearance had a name. Mara Voss listened to Irene's recording twice without changing her expression. The first time, she sat at the conference table in the county substation with one hand resting beside a black notebook. The second time, she closed her eyes, not from emotion, Russ thought, but to remove the room and hear only the order of sounds. Irene's voice, the pounding at the door, Mason barking, wood breaking, the violent rattle of hive boxes collapsing. Then the name. Daryl. When the recording ended, Mara opened her eyes and wrote down a timestamp. She was 46, with a narrow, angular face and dark hair cut just below the ears, silver gathering at both temples. Her steel-gray parka hung over the back of the chair. Beneath it, she wore a charcoal turtleneck and black field trousers, clothing chosen to pass unnoticed through offices, snowbanks, and courtrooms. Russ had met investigators who filled silence to establish control. Mara used silence to see who could tolerate it. Deputy Evan Cross sat across from her, his folder arranged squarely with the table's edge. Lila stood near the window, arms folded, watching the parking lot as though someone might attempt to steal it. Mason lay beneath Russ's chair. He had been allowed inside only because Mara had first reviewed Nora's medical photographs and then looked at the dog for a long moment. "This confirms Irene believed she was under pressure," Mara said. "It places Daryl Boone near a threatening incident. It does not yet tell us who entered the house, who removed her, or where she is now." Russ's jaw tightened. "You think she left after recording that?" "I think assumptions are how evidence gets damaged. She named him." "She did? And if we want that name to matter in court, we build everything around it correctly." Mara turned to Evan. "The recorder's chain?" "Photographed in place, bagged at the property, logged on return." "Original file copied?" "Read-only forensic copy requested." "Good." She looked toward Russ. "You are a witness, not an investigator." "I'm aware. People who say that usually aren't." Lila's mouth twitched. Mara ignored her. "No confrontations, no private interviews, no entering property because a door happens to be open." "Anything else?" "Yes, if Daryl Boone contacts you, you record the time and call Evan." Russ said nothing. Mara closed her notebook. "I'll treat that as reluctant agreement." The investigation began with Irene's handwriting. Among the ledgers recovered from the apiary shed was a narrow blue notebook filled with honey orders, donations, feed costs, and reminders written in Irene's disciplined hand. Most pages concerned ordinary life: 6 jars for May, 2 gallons for the church kitchen, replacement gloves before spring. Near the back the entries changed. 4 names appeared in a column: Henry Bell, Dorothy Sloan, Arthur Mills, Ruth Calder. Beside each was an address, a date, and the name of a company Russ had never heard of. None of those companies was Summit Vale. Mara requested property records from 3 counties. Evan spent most of the day on the phone, moving from clerk to assessor to recorder and back again. By evening, the whiteboard in the substation held a chain of arrows. Henry Bell's ranch had been transferred to North Crest Services. Dorothy Sloan's acreage went to Alder Ridge Management. Arthur Mills's home and timber parcel passed through Blue Creek Holdings. Ruth Calder's roadside property had been acquired by Stone Harbor Trust. Within months, all four had been transferred again to a regional investment fund. That fund held an option agreement with Summit Vale Development. Lila stared at the board. They hid every purchase under a different coat. Mara capped the marker. Not hidden, separated. There's a difference. For people with lawyers. For anyone trying to prevent a pattern from looking like a pattern. All four owners had been over 75. All had lived alone. Each property lay near a proposed access route, utility corridor, or water easement connected to Summit Vale's resort plans. And each owner had left the area shortly before the land changed hands. The documents shared three names. Dr. Malcolm Hurst had completed evaluations, declaring the owners unable to manage complex decisions. Leon Vance had prepared or witnessed powers of attorney. Sylvia Crane had signed intake or transfer forms connected to a private care facility called Cedar Rest. Russ studied the board. What kind of care facility? That depends which document you believe, Mara said. Cedar Rest had once been licensed as an assisted living residence attached to a small mountain lodge. The license had expired 18 months ago. The company claimed it now provided temporary private convalescent care, a category vague enough to sound legitimate and narrow enough to avoid casual inspection. Its official mailing address was a rented box in Casper. Its physical address led to an abandoned hotel office. People don't disappear, Evan said quietly. They get converted into paperwork. The sentence stayed with Russ. He thought of Irene reduced to assessment scores and signatures. He thought of Mason confined behind wood while forms declared everything orderly. A person could be erased without anyone digging a grave. All it took was enough official language and a community willing to believe privacy was kindness. Mara located Henry Bell through a forwarding address in Montana. The video call took place the following afternoon in May's closed diner, where the internet connection was stronger than at the substation. May drew the blinds and placed a slice of pie beside the computer before remembering Henry could not eat through a screen. That was optimistic, Lila said. May pushed the plate toward Russ. Nothing needs to be wasted. Henry appeared on screen seated in a bright kitchen. He was 82, narrow-shouldered, and bald except for a white fringe above his ears. His nose was large, his skin deeply creased, and his eyes remained sharply alert behind thick glasses. A younger woman moved in the background. His granddaughter, Henry explained. She had driven from Colorado to Montana after receiving a call from someone at Cedar Rest. Henry was slow to begin, not confused, careful. He asked Mara to show identification twice. Then he wanted Evan's name, badge number, and the county where Irene lived. Only after Mara answered did Henry speak. They said I was going for evaluation, he told them. 3 days, maybe 4. Who said that? Mara asked. Mr. Vance brought the papers. Hurst signed the medical page. I never met Hurst. What happened at Cedar Rest? Henry's mouth flattened. They took my phone because calls upset me. That was the phrase. Calls upset you. They opened my mail, gave me pills in a paper cup every night. Do you know what medication? No. Made my arms feel full of sand. He had refused twice. After that, 2 employees stood in the room until he swallowed. Did Sylvia Crane supervise the facility? Henry nodded. Tall woman, blonde hair going gray, always wore pearls, even at breakfast, smiled when she told you no. And Darrell Boone? Henry looked away from the camera. He visited after I said I wouldn't sell. What did he say? That my land was becoming a burden to my family, that I could leave them money instead of problems. Henry leaned closer to the screen. I told him the land was not a problem until he wanted it. Russ almost smiled. Henry did not. I was there 7 weeks. They said my granddaughter stopped calling. She said later she called every day. How did you get out? Evan asked. A woman from the kitchen. Henry searched for the name. Elena Marquez. She had slipped Henry a phone after midnight and locked the laundry room door from the inside while he called his granddaughter. The family arrived with an attorney the next morning. Cedar Rest released him rather than risk immediate scrutiny, then claimed the stay had always been voluntary. Why didn't you report them? Lila asked. Henry's granddaughter stopped moving behind him. Henry removed his glasses and polished them with the hem of his shirt. I did. The room became still. I called the county. They said the documents were valid. I called the state office. They asked if I could prove I had been forced. Cedar Rest sent a letter saying I was confused during medication adjustment. He replaced the glasses. After a while, every time you tell the truth and someone writes down that you're confused, you start sounding confused even to yourself. That was the point in the conversation when the case stopped being about forged signatures. Russ saw it in Evan's face, in the way May pressed one hand flat against the table, in Lila's sudden refusal to look at anyone. The theft was not only of property, it was the theft of authority over one's own mind. Before ending the call, Henry gave them one last detail. There was another woman there. Tiny white hair, talked about bees, kept asking for her dog. Mason, lying beneath the table, raised his head at the word. Russ felt the room tilt toward him. What did she call the dog? Mara asked. Henry closed his eyes. Mason. For the first time since meeting Mara, Russ saw something pass through her composure. Not surprise. Confirmation. She asked Henry when he had last seen Irene. 9 days ago, he said. Maybe 10. Alive. The word did not need to be spoken. It moved through everyone anyway. Lila found Elena Marquez before Mara did, not through official databases, but through the church's old winter pantry list. Elena's mother had once lived outside Ash Hollow and received food deliveries after surgery. Irene had written Elena's number beside the family name years ago. Lila called from a prepaid phone. Elena hung up twice. On the third attempt, Lila said only, I'm with Mason. Silence answered. Then a woman whispered, Is he alive? That evening, Elena called back. Her voice was low and breathless, as though she were speaking from inside a closet. She was 38, a care aide at Cedar Rest, and the mother of an 11-year-old daughter. Darrell had learned she was separated from her husband and facing a custody dispute. He told her that if she accused the facility of abuse, the company would describe her as unstable, dishonest, and negligent. He said he knew which judge handled family cases, Elena told Lila. Was that true? I don't know. It was enough that it might be. Elena had stayed, but she had also begun keeping notes. Dates when Darrell arrived, names of patients transferred without family notification, medication changes ordered without proper charts, Irene's attempts to call Ash Hollow. She's alive, Elena said. Russ stood so quickly his chair struck the wall. Mason rose with him. Where? Lila asked. Cedar Rest, but not the building and the records. There's an old hotel on the mountain. The patients are kept in the service wing behind it. Can you give us the road? Not safely over the phone. Is Irene hurt? She's weak. They keep saying she's agitated, so they increase her medication. She learned to hide some of it. Because you helped her? Elena did not answer directly. She talks to Mason at night like he's in the room. Mason stood near the phone, ears forward. Russ looked down at him. For the first time, the distance between dog and owner had a shape. Not endless wilderness, not death. A building, a room, a woman still speaking his name. Mara took over contact after that. She established a coded schedule for Elena to report safely and warned everyone that no one was to approach Cedar Rest until they had a legal and operational plan. The case was finally moving. That was when Darrell Boone came to the cabin. He arrived just before sunset in a black luxury SUV, too clean for Russ's road. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a cream turtleneck, polished boots sinking slightly into the snow. His gray-blonde hair had been combed neatly back, untouched by the wind. He carried no visible threat, only an envelope. Mason stood behind Russ in the cabin doorway. Darrell smiled. "Mr. Porter, I hoped we could speak privately." "We are?" Darrell glanced at Mason. "I heard the animal required extensive treatment." "His name is Mason." "Of course." Darrell stepped no closer. "I'd like to cover the veterinary expenses. Summit Vale has always supported animal welfare in this county." Russ looked at the envelope. "Why?" "Because misunderstandings grow expensive." His pale blue eyes moved briefly across Russ's combat shirt, the field watch, the scar near his jaw. "I also understand you've had a difficult adjustment since leaving service." Russ's body went still. Darrell continued in the tone of a man offering sympathy at a funeral. "Isolation, marital strain, episodes of disturbed sleep, these things can affect how events are interpreted." Mason moved to Russ's left side. No growl. No bared teeth. Only presence. Darrell's smile narrowed. "It would be unfortunate if your concern for a dog encouraged people to see patterns that aren't there." Russ's hand closed. He imagined crossing the porch in 2 steps. Darrell expected it, perhaps wanted it. A bruise, a witness, a report describing an unstable veteran threatening a respected developer. Mason looked up. The old shepherd's amber eyes held no command, only recognition. Russ opened his hand. "You came here to make me angry." "I came to help." "No, you came to choose which version of me gets written down." For the first time, Darrell's smile disappeared. Russ took the envelope and tore it in half without opening it. "Now you can write that I declined." Darrell left without another word. Mason watched the SUV until the taillights vanished among the trees. That night, Mara called. Insurance billing had led her to a medical transport company owned by another Summit Vale subsidiary. One of its vans had been parked in a rented garage 30 miles east of Ash Hollow. They obtained access through the property manager and found the vehicle unlocked. Inside were sedatives, patient restraints, 6 incomplete transfer forms, and a lavender wool blanket. Mason was brought to the garage under Lila's supervision. The moment the blanket was removed from its evidence-safe container, Mason stopped breathing for half a second. Then he surged forward. Russ caught the harness. Mason pressed his nose toward the fabric, inhaling with short, urgent pulls. His body began to tremble, but this time the weakness did not come from injury. He knew the scent. Irene had been in that vehicle. Mara's phone rang. "Elena." The message was brief. Darrell had ordered Cedar Rest cleared before morning. The patients were being prepared for transfer. No destinations had been entered on the forms. Outside, snow struck the garage doors in sudden white bursts. The storm had reached the valley. Russ held Mason's harness as the dog stared at Irene's blanket. For weeks, the people behind Summit Vale had erased the elderly one document at a time. Now they were preparing to erase them from the map entirely. The storm reached Ash Hollow before the search warrant did. By 9 that evening, snow had erased the edges of the road outside the county substation. Wind pressed against the windows in long, low surges, making the glass tremble in its frame. Weather reports showed the mountain pass narrowing beneath heavy accumulation, while 2 state police vehicles remained stalled south of the ridge behind a jackknifed fuel truck. Mara Voss stood beneath the fluorescent lights with a phone against one ear and her black notebook open in front of her. "No," she said, I understand the conditions. I'm asking whether the judge has signed it." Evan waited beside the evidence table, coat already zipped. Russ stood near the door with snow melting from his shoulders. Mason lay on a folded blanket at his feet, wearing a charcoal thermal coat over the olive-drab support harness Lila had fitted around his chest. The old shepherd's breathing had improved. The swelling around his eyes was gone, and the right side of his muzzle had settled into a permanent crookedness rather than an emergency. The bandage on his front paw remained clean. Lila still looked as though she might physically block the doorway. "This is a terrible idea," she said. "You've said that," Russ replied. "I'm increasing the volume because no one has improved." Mason lifted his head. Lila pointed at him. "You are included." Mara ended the call and looked toward Evan. "The judge is reviewing the affidavit. We do not have the warrant yet." Evan's shoulders tightened. "Elena says they're preparing 6 patients for transport." "I know. And the storm closes the North Road in another hour." "I know that, too." Mara spoke without impatience. That made the limitations sound more severe. She placed both palms on the table. "Evan, you go as far as the public access road near Cedar Rest. Observe. Document. Confirm vehicles. Staff movement. Patient condition, if visible. You do not enter the facility without a warrant unless you witness an immediate threat to life or serious bodily harm." Evan nodded. "Russ knows the old logging routes," Mara continued. "He can guide you through the mountain section, but he is there as a civilian witness and driver. Nothing more." Russ said, "Understood." Mara looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. "I would enjoy believing you." "I'd enjoy giving you a reason." "That would be new for both of us." Lila stepped between Russ and the door. "Mason stays here." The dog rose. It took effort, but no assistance. "He's been recovering 6 days," Russ said. "He is 11 years old, underweight, recovering from multiple stings, exposure, dehydration, and torn paw pads. He won't be running. He shouldn't be going." Mason walked to the evidence table where Irene's lavender blanket had been placed inside a sealed container. He stood beneath it, nose raised, body rigid. Lila watched him. "He knows she's alive," Russ said. "No, he knows her scent is here." "That's enough for him." "That does not make it medically wise." "No?" Russ did not argue further. He simply waited. Lila hated that more than persuasion. It required her to make the decision without the satisfaction of defeating him. She crouched beside Mason, checked his gums, listened to his breathing, then pressed both hands along his ribs and hips. If he starts panting hard, he goes back in the vehicle. If the paw bleeds, he stops. He does not walk long distance. He does not climb stairs unless there is no alternative. Russ nodded. "There's water in the insulated flask, medication in the red pouch, and a chemical warming pad under his blanket, not directly against his skin." "I know." "You know many things in a manner that creates work for me." Mason touched his nose to Lila's wrist. Her expression softened for less than a second. "Traitor," she whispered. They left in 2 vehicles. Evan drove the patrol SUV. Russ followed in his pickup, with Mason secured across the back seat. The thermal blanket was tucked around the shepherd's body, and Irene's scent sample remained sealed inside Evan's vehicle for evidentiary reasons. Snow swept sideways through the headlights. The highway west narrowed quickly, then disappeared beneath wind-blown drifts. Evan's taillights glowed and vanished in alternating bursts as the 2 vehicles climbed toward the ridge. Russ knew these roads from hauling firewood and repairing generators at isolated hunting cabins. The official route to the old Cedar Rest property crossed the North Pass, but the pass would already be filling. He called Evan over the radio. "Take the quarry turn in a half a mile." "That road isn't on the county map." "It was never a county road." That's supposed to comfort me. It means no one spent money maintaining it. That did not help. They turned onto the old logging track. Pines closed around them. The wind weakened beneath the trees, but visibility worsened as branches shed powder onto the windshield. The road climbed in sharp switchbacks, its outer edge falling away toward a ravine invisible in the dark. Mason remained quiet. Russ checked him often in the mirror. The dog's eyes were open, but his head rested on the blanket. He seemed to be conserving himself deliberately, as though age and training had negotiated a temporary agreement. Halfway up the mountain, Evan's brake lights flared. A lodgepole pine had fallen across the road. Its trunk was nearly 2 feet thick, branches tangled against the uphill bank. There was no room to drive around it without risking the drop. Russ stopped and stepped into the storm. Evan joined him, shining a flashlight over the trunk. "How long?" "With a sharp chain, 15 minutes. "And with yours?" Russ opened the toolbox in the truck bed. 12. The chainsaw started on the 4th pull. They worked from opposite sides, Russ cutting while Evan dragged away the smaller branches. Snow gathered on their shoulders faster than they could shake it free. The tree pinched the sawbar once, forcing Russ to drive a wedge into the cut with the back of an axe. When the final section rolled downhill, it struck another trunk with a deep wooden crack. Russ shut off the saw. In the sudden silence, Mason barked from the truck. Only once. Russ turned. The shepherd was standing against the rear window, staring toward the right side of the road. Not ahead. Not west. Toward a shallow opening between the trees where snow had buried what appeared to be an abandoned track. Russ opened the rear door. Mason leaned forward, nose working through the narrow gap. "What is it?" Evan asked. Russ shone his light toward the opening. At first there was only uneven snow, then the beam found 2 parallel depressions. Tire tracks, recent enough that the wind had not filled them completely. Evan crouched near the nearest mark. "Same general width as a transport van. Could be logging. At 10 at night during a blizzard? Bad time to cut timber." Evan looked toward Mason. "Can he smell Irene from here?" "No." Russ studied the dog. "But he may recognize the vehicle odor from the garage? Fuel, disinfectant, whatever was inside." Evan checked his map. "The official Cedar Rest entrance is another 4 miles north." Russ followed the hidden road with his flashlight. Maybe official is the problem. They moved the vehicles off the main logging track and followed the turn. The side road descended through dense timber, narrow enough that branches scraped both doors. After half a mile, they found the van. It had been backed beneath a crude lean-to made of corrugated metal and camouflage netting. Snow covered the hood, but not the windshield. The engine was cold. Evan activated his body camera and approached. The rear doors were unlocked. Inside, 2 bench seats had been removed. A restraint strap hung from the wall rail. An empty medication carrier sat on the floor beside a pair of disposable gloves. On the front passenger seat lay a folded women's coat. Lavender wool. Russ recognized the color before Evan lifted the evidence light. One cuff had been repaired with pale thread. A brass B-shaped pin remained attached near the collar. "Irene's," Russ said. "You've seen it?" "No, but May described the pin." Evan photographed the coat without moving it. Beneath the seat, he found a clipboard holding a transport sheet. 6 names. Irene Whitaker was 3rd. Each line listed a departure time after midnight. The destination column was blank. Evan photographed that, too. "We need Mara." The radio returned only static. The mountain blocked the signal. Russ walked back to the truck. Mason was already pressing against the door. He opened it, but held the harness. The dog lowered his nose toward the air, then pulled toward the van with sudden force. Russ allowed him only as far as the rear bumper. Mason smelled the threshold, then the running board, then the packed snow beneath the doors. His body changed. The uncertain movements of an old dog disappeared, replaced by a narrower focus. His head lowered, his ears angled forward. He followed a line away from the van, toward the trees behind the lean-to. Russ kept the lead short. "This is where he starts," he told Evan. "Not from Ash Hollow, not across the mountain. Here." Evan understood. They did not need Mason to perform a miracle. They needed him to recognize the last place Irene's scent had been concentrated. Behind the lean-to, footprints led through a narrow break in the pines. Snow had softened their edges, but several people had traveled the route recently. The trail continued less than 200 yards before a building emerged from the storm. It was not the Cedar Rest shown in the brochures. The old hotel stood farther uphill, its dark windows and sagging balconies visible through the trees. This structure sat behind it, a long, low-service wing of stained concrete and weathered siding, partially hidden by maintenance sheds and an old laundry building. Warm yellow light leaked beneath several doors. A generator hummed somewhere beyond the wall. Russ touched Mason's harness. The dog stared at the building. This time he did not pull. He knew they had arrived. Evan attempted the radio again. One broken response came through from Mara, then vanished beneath static. He sent the coordinates by text and watched the phone until the message showed as pending. "No warrant confirmation," he said. "We observe." "That's the order." They returned Mason to the truck and moved closer on foot. From the edge of the trees, they could see the service yard. 2 small passenger buses idled near a side entrance. Exhaust rolled beneath their rear bumpers. Staff moved between the door and vehicles carrying plastic bags, folded wheelchairs, and boxes of medication. Then the patients began to emerge. The first was an elderly man in pajama pants, house slippers, and a winter coat that had not been buttoned. A staff member held his elbow, hurrying him toward the bus. A woman followed in a thin blue nightgown beneath a cardigan. Her bare ankles showed above soft indoor shoes. The temperature had fallen below 0. Evan stepped from the trees. "County Sheriff's Office." Every movement in the yard stopped. Russ remained several feet behind him, with Mason's lead in hand. The old dog stood close to Russ's leg, protected beneath the thermal coat. A woman descended the steps. Sylvia Crane was tall, perhaps 5'10", with blonde-gray hair swept into a smooth twist. A strand of pearls rested above the collar of her dark coat, perfectly arranged despite the hour and weather. Her posture carried the composed annoyance of someone accustomed to turning questions into breaches of etiquette. "Deputy," she said, "you are obstructing an emergency medical transfer." "Where are these patients being taken?" "To an alternate facility. Our heating system has failed." Russ listened. Behind the walls, a forced air furnace cycled on with a metallic rumble. Warm exhaust drifted from a vent near the roof. He looked at Evan. Evan had heard it too. "What facility?" Evan asked. Sylvia's eyes moved briefly toward the body camera on his chest. "That information is protected." "Protected from the patients?" One of the elderly men near the bus looked toward Evan. "No one told us," he said. A male aide tightened his grip on the man's elbow. Sylvia turned slightly. "Mr. Cole is confused." "I asked where we were going," the man said, louder this time. "They gave me a coat and took my watch." Evan moved closer. "Release his arm." The aide obeyed. Sylvia's composure thinned. "We have authorization from the responsible guardians." "Show me the transfer orders." "They are inside." "Then bring them out." Snow collected on Sylvia's shoulders. She did not move. Mason lifted his head. The dog had been watching the buses, the staff, the doors. Now his nose turned toward the building. He took one step. Russ held the lead. Mason whined. It was not the faint, strained sound from the road. This was sharper, urgent, almost disbelieving. Russ followed the direction of his gaze. At the far end of the service wing, beyond the main entrance, a narrow hallway connected to an older laundry block. One interior door was visible through a dirty pane of glass. Mason pulled. Russ went with him, keeping the leash short enough to protect the injured paw. "Russ," Evan warned, "he has something. That doesn't authorize entry." "I know." They moved along the outside wall while Evan stayed close enough to maintain control of the scene. Mason ignored the open side entrance and continued toward the hallway window. Then he stopped at a solid gray door. No exterior handle. A small wired glass panel sat at eye level, fogged from warmth inside. Mason pressed his nose to the lower seam and inhaled. His whole body began to shake. Russ had seen him tremble from cold, from exhaustion, from pain. This was none of those. The dog scratched once at the metal, then again. He gave a low, broken cry. From somewhere beyond the door came the sound of movement. A bed frame creaked. Silence followed. Then a woman's voice, weak and distant, crossed the hallway. "Mason?" The shepherd froze. Even his breathing seemed to stop. Russ's hand tightened around the harness. Inside the building, the voice came again. Not louder, only more certain. "Mason!" The dog surged against the door. Russ held him back before the bandaged paw struck metal again. Mason turned toward him, amber eyes wide, asking for something Russ could not give without authority. Evan reached them at a run. "Who's in there?" he called. No answer came from staff. Sylvia approached from the yard. "That wing is restricted." "Is Irene Whitaker inside?" Evan asked. Sylvia's face remained composed, but her right hand closed around the edge of her coat. "I cannot discuss patient identities." A dull impact sounded behind the door. Then Irene's voice, barely audible. "Help me." Evan touched his body camera and spoke clearly. "Time is 11:43 p.m. I have an identified missing and potentially endangered adult calling for help behind a locked, restricted door. Facility management refuses access and has attempted to move vulnerable patients during severe weather without providing destinations." He faced Sylvia. "Open the door." "You do not have a warrant." "I am acting under emergency aid and exigent circumstances. Open it now." Sylvia did not move. The furnace continued running behind her, betraying the lie about failed heat. Evan looked at Russ. "Can you breach it without hitting anyone on the other side?" Russ studied the hinges, frame, and direction of swing. "Inward. Strike below the lock." "Do it." Russ handed Mason's lead to Evan. He stepped back once, planted his boot beside the lock, and drove forward. The frame cracked but held. Mason barked. Russ struck again. Wood split away from the metal latch. On the third impact, the door burst inward. Warm, stale air rolled into the snow. A dim hallway stretched beyond it, lined with closed rooms. At the far end, beneath a failing ceiling light, another door stood locked. Mason pulled Evan across the threshold. From behind that final door came Irene Whitaker's voice. This time, she was crying. The second door gave way more quietly than the first. Russ forced the latch with the flat edge of Evan's pry bar, while Evan kept one hand on Mason's harness and the other near his radio. The metal plate bent inward. A narrow gap appeared, and warm, stale air slipped through, carrying the smells of disinfectant, wool, old medicine, and fear. Mason stopped pulling. For one suspended moment, the old dog seemed afraid of what waited beyond the opening. Then Russ pushed the door wide. The room was small enough to feel temporary, as though no one had intended a person to live there for long. A low bed stood against the wall beneath a window painted shut. The radiator was cold despite the furnace running elsewhere in the building. A plastic cup sat beside a pitcher of water, and several pale tablets had been hidden beneath a folded washcloth on the bedside table. Irene Whitaker lay propped against two flattened pillows. She had grown thin. The purple cardigan hanging from her shoulders looked borrowed from a larger woman. Her white hair, usually pinned neatly with the brass B-clip May had described, fell loose around her face. Bruises darkened one wrist, and the skin beneath her eyes had the gray cast of exhaustion. But her gaze was clear. It went past Russ, past Evan, straight to Mason. The shepherd entered one step at a time. His thermal coat brushed the doorframe. His bandaged paw landed carefully, and the permanent slant of his healed muzzle made each breath look more difficult than it was. He did not rush to the bed. He approached with the solemn caution of an animal who had imagined this moment too many times to trust it immediately. Irene lifted both hands. "Mason!" The dog reached her knees and stopped. Then he lowered his head into her lap. Every line of effort left his body at once. Irene folded over him, one arm around his neck and the other pressed against the black saddle of his back. She did not sob loudly. The sound that came from her was smaller, almost embarrassed, as though grief had been forced to survive too long without permission. Her fingers moved over the torn edge of his right ear, the silver along his cheeks, and the crooked swelling that still pulled one side of his mouth downward. "You didn't leave me behind," she whispered. Mason closed his eyes. Russ looked away, not because the moment was private, because it was too complete. It held everything he had failed to understand when Caroline stood beside the cabin door years earlier, that loyalty was not proven by remaining unhurt, and love did not become less real because someone had failed to prevent a loss. Evan entered the room and spoke gently. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Deputy Cross. You're safe for the moment, but I need to ask whether you require immediate medical help." Irene kept one hand buried in Mason's fur. "I require water that doesn't taste like a mop bucket." Evan almost smiled. Russ filled the cup from a sealed bottle on his belt. Irene drank carefully. "Can you tell us who brought you here?" Evan asked. "Darrell Boone." The name came without hesitation. "Who else?" "Two men. One I knew from Summit Vale meetings. The other never gave a name." "Did you come voluntarily?" Irene's eyes hardened. "No." She looked at Russ for the first time. Recognition took a moment. "Amos's winter mechanic." Russ nodded. "You used to leave before supper." "I still do." Cowardly habit. Her voice was weak, but the old precision remained. Mason opened one eye, as though confirming she had truly returned. Irene told the story in fragments because Evan insisted she pause whenever her breathing grew shallow. Darrell had arrived at the farm with papers and a polished explanation. He said the resort road would bring jobs, emergency access, and tax money. He said Irene's property had become too difficult for someone her age. When she refused, he stopped pretending the visit was a negotiation. The men cut power to the house. They searched drawers and cabinets for the land deeds and Amos's old records. One of them overturned the first hive with a metal bar. Others followed when Mason charged across the yard. "He went for Darrell," Irene said. Mason's ear shifted at the name. One man struck him with a boot. Another slammed the shed door before he could get back out. Russ's hand closed around the bed rail. Irene noticed. "Don't give that man your temper," she said. "He's already stolen enough." The sentence landed more firmly than accusation. She continued. They dragged her toward the waiting vehicle. She could still hear Mason throwing himself against the shed door. For days afterward, she heard that sound each time she tried to sleep. At Cedar Rest, Sylvia Crane told the staff Irene had severe behavioral disturbance. Her phone was taken. Letters disappeared. Medication appeared in paper cups without labels. Elena Marquez had begun helping after noticing Irene's speech was clearer before the nightly pills. She showed Irene how to hide tablets beneath her tongue, then later beneath the washcloth when supervision became less strict. "Why didn't Elena call sooner?" Evan asked. "She has a daughter?" Irene said it as though that explained everything. Perhaps it did. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Evan turned. A small woman in sage-green scrubs stood beyond the doorway. Dark curls had been pinned into a hurried knot, and a blue hair tie circled one wrist above a plastic bracelet made of children's beads. Her face was pale with fear. "Elena?" Irene asked. The woman nodded. "I'm sorry." Irene extended one hand. Elena entered and took it. "You stayed," Irene said. "That is not the same as doing nothing." Elena's mouth tightened. "I should have gotten you out. You kept me awake enough to know I was still myself." For the first time, Elena began to cry. The sound of engines rose outside. Not the buses. A heavier vehicle entered the yard, followed by several doors slamming. Darryl had arrived. He came through the main corridor wearing a black parka over a gray sweater, snow dusting his shoulders. Sylvia followed him, speaking quickly. Behind them was Leon Vance, a broad-faced man in a dark suit coat too thin for the weather, carrying a leather document case against his chest. Darryl stopped when he saw Russ in Irene's doorway. His expression did not fracture. It reorganized. "Deputy Cross," he said, "you have entered a private medical facility without a warrant." Evan touched his body camera. "I entered after hearing a missing adult call for help from behind a locked door while staff attempted to transfer patients during a severe weather emergency." That is a creative description. It's recorded. Darryl's gaze moved to Russ. "And this civilian broke the door. Under my direction. Convenient." Russ said nothing. That seemed to trouble Darryl more than anger would have. Lila's voice rose from the far hallway. "Move those patients back inside before someone loses a foot." She entered wearing a wine-red rescue parka, medical bag over one shoulder. Behind her came two members of Ash Hollow's volunteer ambulance crew pushing a stretcher. May Holloway followed in a heavy navy coat, looking furious enough to regulate the temperature by herself. Past the windows, headlights multiplied in the storm. A county snowplow had arrived first, clearing the road for family members, emergency volunteers, and Reverend Thomas Reed from the small Ash Hollow church. They had not come as a mob. They carried blankets, oxygen, thermoses, contact lists, and names. May saw Irene. The anger left her face. "Oh, honey." Irene managed a tired smile. "Your biscuits are still terrible." May covered her mouth. The tension in the hallway changed. Until that moment, Darryl had been dealing with files, institutions, and isolated witnesses. Now the people he had reduced to paperwork were being recognized one by one. A woman near the bus shouted her father's name. An elderly patient answered. A volunteer wrapped a heated blanket around his shoulders, while another photographed the condition of his clothing. Reverend Reed stood beside a confused woman and repeated her daughter's phone number until she remembered it. The community did not block the vehicles. It made leaving invisibly impossible. Mara Voss arrived 20 minutes later with 2 state troopers and the signed warrant. She entered without ceremony. "Elena Marquez?" Elena stepped forward. From beneath her cardigan, she removed a narrow notebook sealed inside a plastic food bag. Then another packet, copied medication charts, dates of unrecorded transfers, lists of Darryl's visits, and photographs of prescription bottles labeled for people who had never been examined by the prescribing doctor. "I kept originals where I could," Elena said. "Copies when I couldn't." Mara accepted the package with gloved hands. "You did well." "No," Elena replied. "I did late." Mara looked at her. Late evidence still saves people. The search of Sylvia's office began immediately. The first drawer held altered intake forms. A locked cabinet contained blank powers of attorney bearing Leon Vance's seal. The computer stored property files sorted by age, family proximity, debt level, and estimated land value. Several patient charts contained sedative orders signed by Dr. Malcolm Hurst on dates when he had been outside the state. In Leon's case, Mara found unsigned transfer contracts and a list of 6 patients scheduled to cross into Idaho before dawn. No receiving facility was listed. The evidence did not create a dramatic silence. It created work. Troopers photographed rooms, sealed computers, read rights, and separated staff for interviews. Paramedics checked every patient. Family members provided names and dates. Elena pointed out the hidden storage room where confiscated phones and mail had been kept in labeled bins. Daryl's calm began to thin. "You're constructing criminal intent from administrative irregularities," he told Mara. She closed a file drawer. "No, I'm documenting a system designed to prevent vulnerable people from objecting while their property changed hands." "You'll regret saying that publicly." "I didn't say it publicly." Daryl glanced toward the side exit. Russ saw the decision before the movement. So did Mason. The old shepherd had remained beside Irene's bed, exhausted but alert. When Daryl turned toward the rear corridor, Mason stepped into the doorway. He did not lunge. He lowered his body, planted all 4 paws, and produced a growl so quiet it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards rather than the air. Daryl stopped. "You might want to control that animal." Russ took the harness. "He is controlled." Daryl moved 1 step. Mason matched him. The motion was clean, measured, and unmistakably trained. Russ felt the power gathering beneath the dog's old frame. Not rage, purpose. For weeks, Mason had carried the belief that he had failed Irene. Now the man responsible stood within reach. Russ knelt beside him. "Enough, Mason." The dog did not look away from Daryl. Russ tightened his grip gently. "The rest is ours." For a heartbeat, Mason remained rigid. Then he stepped backward. He obeyed. That choice mattered more than a bite ever could. Mara signaled to the troopers. Daryl Boone was arrested on suspicion of unlawful restraint, fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, and obstruction. Sylvia Crane was taken into custody after trying to destroy a medication log in a utility sink. Leon Vance was arrested with forged documents in his possession. Dr. Malcolm Hurst was placed under investigation and had his prescribing authority reviewed. Sheriff Howard Pike was suspended pending inquiry into ignored complaints, conflicts of interest, and interference with Evans' reports. At that stage, investigators found no evidence that Pike had designed the scheme, only that ambition and cowardice had made him useful to it. By dawn, 6 elderly patients had been transported to the regional hospital. Irene lay in a quiet room near the end of the second-floor corridor. Fluids ran into one arm. Her B-shaped hair clip, recovered from the lavender coat, rested on the bedside table. Mason slept beside the bed with his head beneath her hand. Russ sat outside the open door. Lila brought him coffee and did not ask whether he wanted company. She simply took the chair beside him. Through the doorway, Irene's fingers moved once in Mason's fur. The dog did not wake. Russ watched them breathe. For years, he had mistaken vigilance for love. He had believed caring for someone meant preparing constantly for the moment they would be taken away. But nothing was being taken now. Not in this room, not tonight. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Russ allowed himself to sit beside something fragile without rehearsing its loss. The law moved more slowly than winter. By the time the first hearing was scheduled, 3 weeks had passed since Cedar Rest. Snow still held the western fields beneath a hard white crust, and the roads through Ash Hollow remained narrow trenches between plowed banks. Daryl Boone had not been convicted. Neither had Sylvia Crane or Leon Vance. Their attorneys spoke of misunderstood contracts, voluntary care agreements, administrative mistakes, and frightened witnesses whose memories had been influenced by medication. Dr. Malcolm Hurst claimed his signatures had been used without his full knowledge. Howard Pike, suspended from the sheriff's office, insisted he had merely trusted documents that appeared legitimate. The explanations multiplied because that was what explanations did when money could afford them. But the land stopped moving. A district judge issued a temporary injunction freezing every property transaction connected to the companies under investigation. Titles were not immediately restored, contracts were not magically erased. Yet the former owners were granted access to their homes and land while the civil and criminal cases proceeded. For Irene Whitaker, that meant the farm still belonged to the argument, but it could no longer be taken from her in silence. She spent the first 2 weeks after the hospital at Lila Brennan's house in a downstairs room close to the veterinary clinic. Lila pretended the arrangement was medically necessary. Irene pretended not to notice that the bedroom had been repainted, a handrail installed beside the shower, and every loose rug removed before she arrived. Mason slept across the doorway. His body recovered faster than Irene's, though not completely. The fur over his ribs thickened as he gained weight. The torn paw pads closed. The swelling around his muzzle disappeared, leaving the right side permanently lower than the left. He had also developed strong opinions about Lila's refrigerator. On the 5th morning, she discovered him sitting in front of it with one of her kitchen towels in his mouth. "I know you can't open it," she told him. Mason stared at her. "That is not a challenge." Irene, watching from the breakfast table, said, "Amos once found him inside a patrol car with 6 confiscated hamburgers." "Did he eat them?" "He preserved the evidence." Lila looked at the dog. Mason slowly set down the towel. Russ visited every afternoon. At first, he brought practical things: firewood, a repaired lamp, a better rubber tip for Irene's cane. Then he began arriving without objects to justify his presence. He still stood near the door too long. Irene never invited him to sit. She simply placed a second cup on the table and continued talking until he understood that leaving would now require an explanation. One afternoon, she caught him examining the brass B-clip resting beside her medicine. "You remember that?" she asked. "From the transport van." Before that, Russ did remember. Years ago, during his first winter back in Wyoming, Amos Whitaker had hired him to repair fences and rebuild a shed roof. Russ had been newly discharged, carrying his silence with such intensity that people mistook it for pride. Amos had paid in cash. Irene had added soup. She brought it to Russ's cabin in a blue enamel pot and remained on the porch while he insisted he had already eaten. "You lied poorly then, too," she said. "I wasn't hungry." "You ate 4 bowls. It was cold. You hid the pot under your sink for 2 weeks because returning it meant having a conversation." Russ looked at the floor. "I washed it. Eventually." Amos had never asked about the war. He gave Russ difficult work, corrected him when he cut board short, and paid him exactly what had been promised. Irene supplied food and ignored every attempt to repay her. They had offered a kind of shelter Russ was too damaged to recognize. Now Irene leaned back in Lila's chair and watched him understand it years too late. "Why didn't you tell me you remembered?" Russ asked. "Because you were trying very hard to be a stranger." The sentence held no cruelty. That made it harder to dismiss. When Irene was strong enough to leave Lila's house, she refused every suggestion involving long-term residential care. "No offense to the profession," she said, "but I have recently completed my tour." Living alone at the farm was equally impossible, at least through the end of winter. The heating system needed repairs. The lane was difficult for emergency vehicles. Irene's strength had not returned, and Mason could no longer be expected to compensate for every danger by himself. The solution emerged at May's diner over coffee, pie, and an argument involving 7 people who all believed they were being subtle. Russ had an unused guest house beside his cabin. It had once belonged to a trapper, then served as storage for broken furniture, old tools, and 3 boxes Russ had not opened since Caroline left. Lila said it was close to her clinic. Evan said the county road was kept clear. May said Irene would be near town without being inside anyone's business except Russ's, which desperately required supervision. Russ said nothing for long enough that everyone looked at him. Then he asked Irene, "Would you want that?" "Not need." "Want?" Irene studied him. "Does the roof leak?" "Only over the back room." "Then it has character?" The town repaired the guest house in 9 days. Evan rewired the kitchen on his day off. Reverend Reed brought 2 volunteers from the church to replace the porch steps. May delivered curtains that Irene rejected as aggressively cheerful, then hung them anyway. Russ fixed the roof, rebuilt the wood stove chimney, and installed a low ramp for Mason. He worked without issuing orders. That was new. When someone handed him the wrong tool, he did not take over. When a volunteer cut a board half an inch short, Russ showed him how to correct it instead of silently doing the job again. The change was small enough that no one mentioned it, but Mason noticed everything. On moving day, the old shepherd walked from the truck into the guest house, inspected each room, then returned to the porch and sat between Irene and Russ. He looked first at her, then at him, then toward both doors. His household had become geographically complicated, but acceptable. The Whitaker farm remained under court protection. A legal aid group helped Irene and the other victims establish a conservation trust that would eventually hold development rights while allowing the families to retain ownership and use of their land. The process required meetings, signatures, independent evaluations, and patience. Irene disliked all 4. She attended every meeting anyway. The apiary suffered the greatest loss. Most of the colonies had died after the boxes were overturned and the cold returned. Some had been crushed outright. Others lost their queens or froze after the protective cluster was broken. Walter Quinn arrived in early March to assess the damage. He was 69, narrow as a fence rail, with a long nose and a thick white mustache that curved downward as though disappointed by everything beneath it. He wore brown canvas overalls, a faded moss-green chore coat, and carried an unlit wooden pipe between his teeth. Walter had known Amos for 40 years, and bees for longer, though he claimed bees were more consistent. He opened the first surviving hive and listened. Russ stood beside him in his olive-drab combat shirt, sleeves rolled above the elbows despite the cold. A leather apron covered his charcoal work pants. "What are you listening for?" Russ asked. "Bees." "I assumed that." "Then you're learning." Walter lifted one frame carefully. A small cluster moved around the queen. "Alive," he said. The second colony had survived too, though weakly. Everything else would have to be rebuilt. Russ looked across the broken rows. "How long?" Walter removed the pipe from his mouth. "To replace boxes? Weeks? To restore the colonies? Seasons? To know whether any of it worked?" "Longer?" Russ nodded. He had grown accustomed to repairs where success could be measured by an engine starting or a roof no longer leaking. Living things offered no such certainty. Walter handed him a hive tool. "You can begin by scraping wax." Russ examined the narrow metal blade. "That's it?" "That's today." The work continued through March. Russ built new hive boxes in his shed. Walter rejected the first 3 lids for being too tight, the next 2 for being too loose, and one because it had the emotional character of a coffin. "What does that mean?" Russ asked. "It means make another." Mason lay near the doorway while they worked. Whenever Russ set down a glove, the dog watched it. The first glove disappeared on a Thursday. Russ searched the shed, truck, and porch. Irene found it the next morning beneath the guest house steps, half buried beside one of Mason's old bones. She held it up. "He thinks you work too much." He stole evidence. He preserved it. Russ bought another pair. Mason took only the left one. Life at the two cabins developed a rhythm. Irene ate breakfast at her own table, lunch wherever Lila found her, and dinner with Russ often enough that neither of them bothered calling it an invitation. Mason spent mornings beside Irene's chair and evenings following Russ through the routine of checking the generator, locks, woodpile, and weather gauge. Before settling down, the dog always paused where he could see both houses. Only then did he lie down. Russ's recovery was less visible. He began answering Lila's calls instead of allowing them to ring until silence returned. He told Evan about one night overseas that had followed him into sleep for nearly 12 years. He did not tell the whole story. Evan did not ask for the rest. Once a week, Russ drove 40 miles to a veterans support group in a community center near Cody. At the first meeting, he sat nearest the exit and said nothing. At the second, he gave his name. At the fourth, when another former serviceman described the exhaustion of being loved by someone who could no longer reach him, Russ looked down at his scarred field watch and remained in the room. That evening, he wrote to Caroline. He used paper rather than email because paper did not allow him to delete the difficult parts with one key. He did not ask her to return. He did not tell her he had changed, because he understood that change declared too early was merely another promise. He wrote that she had not failed him. He wrote that she had spent years standing outside a door he had locked from the inside. He apologized for making her believe love had asked too much when, in truth, he had refused to receive it. He mailed the letter before he could improve it into dishonesty. Caroline answered 4 weeks later. Her envelope remained unopened on Russ's kitchen table for 2 days. On the third evening, Irene came in, saw it, and began slicing bread without comment. Russ opened the letter. Caroline wrote that she was glad he had finally found a reason to step back into his own life. She said she had never wanted punishment for him, only freedom for herself from waiting. She did not promise reconciliation. She did not close the door either. Her last line said, "Keep becoming someone you can live with." Russ read it twice. Then he folded the letter and placed it beside his watch. Irene set soup on the table. What did she say? That she's glad I'm trying. Is she coming back? No. Good. Russ looked at her. Irene buttered her bread. You should not turn healing into a performance for a woman who had to leave. Let it belong to you. Russ sat with that. Mason rested beneath the table, one paw over Russ's missing glove. By early April, the snow began withdrawing from Ash Hollow. It disappeared first from south-facing slopes, exposing flattened grass and black soil. Water dripped from the cabin roofs. The roads softened into mud. Fence lines emerged one post at a time, like an old drawing being restored. Walter brought 2 nucleus colonies ordered from a beekeeper farther south. They would not replace what had been lost, but they offered a beginning beside the 2 colonies that had survived. The new hive stood on level ground near Russ's cabin, close enough for Irene to visit without crossing the mountain road. The original farm would remain the heart of Whitaker honey, but these boxes would help rebuild stock until Irene was strong enough to spend longer days there. On the first warm morning, Walter opened the entrance reducers. Irene sat on the porch beneath a plaid blanket, the brass bee clip holding back her white hair. Mason lay at her boots, his honey gold coat clean and full again. Silver framed his muzzle, and the right side still hung slightly lower, granting him an expression of permanent skepticism. Russ adjusted a lid on the nearest box. Walter removed it and set it down. It was fine. Then why'd you move it? To see whether you would argue. Russ stared at him. Walter replaced the lid. You're improving. the bees emerged slowly. One crawled to the edge of the entrance and paused in the pale sun. Another followed. Then several rose into the air, circling low above the boxes, as though the world beyond winter required inspection. Mason lifted his head. A bee drifted in his direction. The old dog stood and moved backward 3 careful steps. Irene laughed. It was not a polite sound. It came freely, carrying across the wet yard. Russ looked at Mason. "You faced armed men." Mason retreated behind Irene's chair. "Wise priorities," she said. Russ began to laugh. At first it was only breath. Then the sound deepened, surprising him with its weight and warmth. He bent forward, one hand on the hive stand, while Walter watched with grave disapproval that fooled no one. The bees continued flying. The land smelled of mud, wood shavings, damp pine, and thawing honey. Russ looked at Irene on the porch, at Mason pretending the chair was a tactical position, and at the new boxes standing beside the old tools Amos had left behind. None of it was restored to what it had been. Irene remained weak. Mason remained scarred. The farm remained entangled in court. Caroline remained elsewhere. Russ still woke some nights with his heart racing and the past pressed close around him. But healing had never promised to reverse time. It only asked whether something living could be built from what remained. Months earlier, Mason had followed Russ's truck through the snow with cracked paws, an empty body, and a muzzle swollen by the price of refusing to abandon Irene. Russ had believed the dog was asking to be rescued. He understood now that Mason had been asking a harder question. Would Russ stop? Would he look? Would he allow another life to matter enough to inconvenience his grief? The first answer had been a truck door opening on a frozen road. Every answer after that had been smaller. A bowl of water, a hand offered without force, a chair occupied instead of abandoned, a letter written without expectation, a hive repaired without knowing whether the bees would return. Mason settled beside Irene's boots. Then he turned his head toward Russ. The distance between them was only a few yards. Russ crossed it anyway. He sat on the porch step, close enough that Mason could rest his chin on one knee, and Irene could place a hand briefly against his shoulder. Above the new hives, the first bees of spring rose into the thin Wyoming light. The valley had not forgotten winter. It had simply begun living beyond it. Sometimes healing does not arrive with answers. It arrives wounded, exhausted, and asking us to stop long enough to care. Mason could not undo what happened to Irene, and Russ could not recover the years he had lost. But by choosing to remain, to help, and to open his heart again, each of them found something worth rebuilding. Perhaps that is one of life's quiet graces. We are not always given the chance to restore the past, but we are often given the chance to love what is still here. What part of Russ, Irene, and Mason's journey stayed with you most? Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories of loyalty, courage, and healing. May your home be filled with peace, and may you recognize the small miracles that find their way to your door.